There's an accelerated push at the State House to close funding and achievement gaps in public schools, but questions remain about how much of the funding gap should be closed by the state, as well as the conditions. Some recommendations for changes in education reform were recently outlined in a report from the Pioneer Institute. Our guest is one of the authors, the Institute's director of the Center for School Reform, Jamie Gass. Thank you very much for being with us, Jamie.
Thanks for having me.
I think our viewers, a lot of them agree on two things about schools in Boston. They need to be better, and we could do with some more money. So as far as reforms you would like to see, give me one or two examples of things that could take us further in that direction.
Well, see, of course, we've been really fortunate in this state because we're the envy of the country, really, in terms of K-12 education reform. And that really started with the '93 law. Tom Birmingham and Mark Roosevelt and Bill Weld and others put together this large bargain of additional money for things like MCAS and charters, and we've done historically well. But to take the reforms to the next level, we'd like to see things like expansion of METCO, better opportunities in terms of vocational technical education. We'd even like to see expansion of private and parochial school choices. So we think that there needs to be, any conversation about more funding needs to be coupled with structural changes.
Now, one of the things that was a little surprising looking at this report was you actually questioned whether there's a need for a whole lot more funding, because I guess on a statewide basis, you say Massachusetts, we do spend a lot of money on public schools.
Well, again, we've been very fortunate because we had a lot of leadership in the 90s and early 2000s, and we do spend very generously, and we should. That one of the parts of the ed reform law was to make sure that the money is spent in a very progressive fashion so the cities that need it the most get it. And that has largely been true. We're spending about $10 billion a year at the state and local level combined. That puts us in pretty good standing in relation to a lot of other states in the union, but the reality too is we are beginning to backslide. There are costs related to healthcare and special education and bilingual education that are driving the cost of education up. I just did along the way, they've also made some tweaks and adjustments. So while we think that they certainly need to continue to spend the money progressively, and they certainly need to be generous in terms of their funding, again, we need to have reforms that go with it. And what many on Beacon Hill are calling for might be too much in comparison to what we actually need.
But if you look at the spending, a lot of that high level statewide it's affluent communities with good schools. But gateway communities, different story. Boston's in the middle. What about that?
Well, Boston and Cambridge are really fortunate in the sense that most of the funding comes from their local tax base. They're two outliers in that regard. Most of the middle cities or gateway cities across the Commonwealth, 70 to 90% of their funding comes from the state. And again, that's the way it should be. But the reality of it is that they do have needs, but there are also deep pockets of chronic underperformance in most of these districts, including Boston, that we feel like in order to warrant an additional expenditure that they have to have some reforms that go along with it.
Now, I know in some communities, and this is probably just going to be outside of Boston, you're recommending that the state have the ability to come in, put the people on the school committee and clean house, as it were. But what about a community like Boston? What things should be different as far as incentivizing school improvement? Well,
we certainly are calling for sort of receivership-like authority where necessary in some of the other gateway cities. Boston is a very unique situation in a lot of ways. We do think that the Commissioner of Education, who's originally from Boston, I think he came up through the Boston system, should have more autonomy to restructure schools as necessary. He has experience doing that as a receiver in Lawrence. And did, I think, a very sound job. And we think, again, 30% of the students in Boston aren't graduating from high school, and some of the ones that are not doing as well as they could and should be. And we think that the state should have, where appropriate, the authority to step in and to help turn around schools. Because sometimes some of the kind of bureaucratic intricacies of things in whether Boston or other cities do serve as barriers to additional reform.
In Boston, we're also debating about standards because they are not quite that high for high school students across the board in Boston. What should be done about that?
Well, Pioneer has been a big driver in the conversation on standards. We were really fortunate in Massachusetts to have the best K-12 standards in the country. They've been gradually eroded over the last 10 years or so, and we're seeing both in Boston and in Massachusetts more generally, we're seeing some backsliding. So we're just firm believers that the fundamentals of what they outline in the law in terms of high quality English, math, science, and history is where we need to start. And that the reality is that there's a lot of kids that are not acquiring literacy and numeracy at the rates that they need to. That's particularly true with poor and minority students. So the kinds of reforms that need to happen on the curriculum side are helped by the funding and a high quality MCAS test so that we have a measure of objective measure of performance. But a lot of the work that goes on in terms of curriculum really is the responsibility of the teachers, and we do need to continue to look at teacher quality.
How would you vet that differently, teacher quality?
Well, I think one of the things they did in the Ed Reform Law in '93 was put a teacher test in, which is of much higher quality than a lot of other states. They essentially had a academic content area test that was coupled with a regular test on pedagogy or how to teach. And so there's a lot of work to be done, I think, actually, that Ed Reform didn't touch in the area of the approved programs or the teacher preparation programs. Many of them don't have the same kind of academic rigor that you'd find in the rest of the college or university. And I think one of the things that, whether it's in Massachusetts or Boston or nationally, is that we still need to continue to work on improving teacher quality.
This is BNN News, and we're talking with Jamie Gass from the Pioneer Institute. Jamie, it seems in this report that you more or less favor the proposal from Governor Baker, which looks generous statewide, but here in Boston, I don't think we would get that much money from that. You think that's enough to take care of Boston?
Well, I mean, so first of all, we definitely have authored the paper independent from what the governor is pushing. I think we probably are more on his side than the legislature's side, but it's also unclear what the legislature is going to do yet. They don't have a bill. We're hearing that they would have a bill perhaps by the end of July, which may mean September. But I think that, again, Boston is fortunate in the sense that unlike a lot of cities in the Commonwealth, it can fund, is able to, so local tax base, able to fund its schools. But there's no question there's some efficiencies, I think, to be honest with you, that need to happen in the Boston public schools. The central office has a reputation being as fairly top-heavy. We've always been a big proponent of making sure that 80, 90 cents of every dollar is spent at the school level, and that's not quite true in a lot of cities. So, I think there are some efficiencies. I mean, Boston is spending, a significant amount of money. I mean, almost really close to $30,000 per pupil. Which is an enormous amount of money, even in comparison to the Fall Rivers and New Bedfords, which are $15,000, $16,000. So I think Boston has plenty of money. I think one of the things that they do need to work on is a lot of the internal reforms within their administration.
Well, you say it's a lot of money, but there are other communities in Massachusetts that spend quite a bit more than Boston, too, aren't there?
Yes, that's true, but those communities also don't get as much state aid, too. So the leafy suburbs really don't get very much state aid at all, whereas Boston gets, 20, 30% of its funding.
Now, there's one topic we don't usually hear spoken about in connection with reform, but you're very concerned about it in this report, and that's teacher pensions and healthcare expenses. Tell me a little bit about that. Yeah,
so Greg Sullivan, and the research director at Pioneer, really deserves an enormous amount of credit for unearthing this large unfunded teacher pension liability. It's a $27 billion price tag, and that includes both Boston and the statewide teachers. So that's aggregated, and that's huge. I mean, at some point, that the funding that and servicing that will exceed the cost of Chapter 70, which is the state funding. So it's a reality, and I think that one of the reasons why we've kind of gone more gingerly in terms of additional state spending in terms of the Chapter 70 formula is because we have this ship at sea in terms of the teacher pensions. It's a big problem. And again, Greg was the first person that I've seen, and a researcher in a long time, that has unearthed this and made this aware to legislators and policymakers.
If you look back at the whole history, the 25 years of education reform, people, I've heard the argument, there are expenses that we didn't anticipate at the beginning, more money for students with disabilities, more money for language learners, the health expenses. People say, we really have to catch up with that, but you say there's been tweaking along the way. So how do you balance between those two?
Yeah, and I think that's, that is what the art of, crafting legislation is all about. I think that they got it right in in 1993. The fact that it hasn't had a major overhaul in 25 years, I think, is a credit to the folks who put it together. But there's no question, it's a balance, and it's a balance between the suburban legislators and the urban legislators. That is a huge tension. I think after 25 years, in spite of the historic successes, a lot of the suburbs are saying, hey, what about us? When, again, the original intent of the ed reform law was to make sure that the money was flowing in a very progressive way. But it's not easy. That striking that balance between the reform and the money and delivering the results is not easy.
And speaking of balances, there's one other recommendation here, and that's about reimbursements for charter schools. That has been a thorny thing in Boston and some other communities too. What do you recommend about that?
Well, so, it's interesting. So Massachusetts is the only state in the union that actually has a reimbursement for charter students. So when a district loses a charter student, it's reimbursed for several years at a fairly generous clip. Most other states and localities, I don't think any, have that. But that is an obligation. The state authorizes these charters. It should be their responsibility to fully fund it. For many years, they did fund it. In recent years, they've been funding it at 70, 80%, and that is an issue. The charter conversation is a complicated one because we have the best charter public schools in the country, and they're better at bridging achievement gaps than any other group of schools in the United States. So they should continue to grow, but the state does have an obligation to honor that reimbursement.
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Jamie Gass from the Pioneer Institute.